Welcome, everybody, to Connecting the Universe. I'm author and researcher Mike Ricksecker, back at you with another interactive class of Connecting the Universe from the Connected Universe portal, of course. So today we're going to be talking about the connection between Egypt and Atlantis, which this is a topic which always fascinates me. Of course, I have a fascination with Egypt anyway. Come along with us, Stargates of Ancient Egypt tour in February. There's still time to go ahead and register for that. It's really, compared to a lot of the other Egypt tours out there, it's really inexpensive. You see these others that are like 6, 8, 10 grand. This is 4,500. So, all right, class question for this evening. If Atlantis truly existed, where do you think it was located, and what do you think happened to its people? So Jin LeBay responded, I always imagine it was in the South Atlantic. I think it was some kind of catastrophic event causing it to sink and all the people drowned. Very boring hypothesis, I know. But I wouldn't necessarily say boring. I mean, it kind of adheres to a lot of the ideas, but we base all of this on the work of Plato. We get the story from him, which he does talk about a catastrophe. It was a catastrophic event that destroyed the civilization of Atlantis. There was an era of time within Egyptian history called Zep-Tepi, or otherwise known as the first time. I'm going to play you a clip from Abydos. Now, what you're looking at here is the traditional king's list. On the other wall are the gods, and the ages for those gods are very, very lengthy. We see stuff like that play out in the Bible. We see stuff like that play out in ancient Sumerian text, where these kings and rulers and gods from long ago lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we see this in Abydos as well. Now, this video clip that I'm about to play, Mohamed's talking about the king's list, but it's pertinent to our conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and play this real quick.
Is that Thutmose right there? The first one?
This is Thutmose 3. That is Amenhotep, that is Thutmose 4. So, and Amenhotep 3. We're supposed to have here Hatshepsut, but we don't have Hatshepsut. Also, after Amenhotep 3, here we're supposed to have Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. We don't, okay? So this could lead us to say, yes, they chose mighty rulers. But there are many names like this king. We don't know who he is at all. We don't have any mention for him anywhere. Unknown king. So if he's a mighty king, why we know nothing about him?
Okay, so what's interesting about that, and we'll see this again in Egypt in February, is that it is a very large king's list. It is not all inclusive, and that's kind of important to understand that when you look at any of these lists that were compiled, they were incomplete. Now, Hatshepsut, who was missing from that, very, very important king. I know she was a female, but they even called the female rulers kings. And so on the other side of that wall, you have these gods that are listed, the netters. The way mainstream calls it is these are the mythical kings, but to the Egyptians, this was the Zep-Tepi. These were the original people of the land. These are the ones who created the land, and then from out of the cataclysm came their culture. Then out back behind Abydos, we've talked about this before, you have the Osirion. Abydos is believed to be where Osiris was buried, not necessarily in the Osirion. That may have been some sort of temple. What is interesting, though, is when we look at the Edfu texts, they talk about the place of the cistern, which some people do believe is a reference to the Osirion here. Now, we're going to spend some time at Edfu here in this particular episode, because Edfu contains the most complete story currently in existence of Zep-Tepi, again, the first time. And so I have another clip here from Mohamed with Jonny, at Edfu. And then we're going to kind of break some things down here.
So according to Graham Hancock, he wrote that there is a story written here by the priest, talks about Atlantis. When I explained this to you 3 years ago, it was because it talks about the story of immigration and it showed the power of the netters who came through the ocean.
Right, but here's the thing. So remember the lecture that Mohamed gave you guys last night? And he was talking to you about the Atlantis story, where we get it from. We were all discussing this before, right? We think that people think that Atlantis is a Greek story. Richard knows this. You can see it in his eyes. But here's the thing, is that Plato tells us the story that he writes in, you know, we hear about Critias and Timaeus, but his uncle Critias told it to him. His uncle Critias got the story from his great-great-great-grandfather, Solon. Solon traveled over to Egypt when it was called Sais. And when he came here, he talked to a priest called Sanchis. And Sanchis said, come here, I got a story to tell you. It's a great story. And we believe the story that Mohammed's showing you is the same one he saw in the Temple of Nefru.
So, Edfu, the immigration depictions that Mohammed was talking about has a lot of similarities to the Atlantis story. When we look at these depictions at Edfu, we see these boats, okay? And basically what is going on here is the story of a cataclysm and their survival of that. First, it's important to note that these texts at Edfu, and by the way, this is what Edfu looks like from the outside, but what's important to note about the Edfu text is that they did not originate on the walls of this temple. What these are copies of what is considered the most important parts of this story from a much larger archive of documents that actually existed at that time. So these texts here describe an era in which the gods of Egypt, or otherwise known as the Netters, lived on a sacred island known as the homeland of the primeval ones. And at some point, a cataclysm of flood and fire destroyed the island and most of its inhabitants. Some survived and set sail on their ships to wander the world and recreate their civilization. So it's almost Atlantis plus Noah, right? I'm going to quote you actually from her book here. And it says, an ancient world, having been constituted, was destroyed. And as a dead world, it came to be the basis of a new period of creation, which at first was the recreation and resurrection of what once had existed in the past. So essentially you have this massive cataclysm, destroys their civilization. There's a few survivors left and they're trying to recreate. And you know, all that they have left is whoever survived that, their knowledge still intact. Now there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of know-how that would have been lost in that cataclysm. So now the question becomes, okay, these texts, if these were copies, where did they originate from? Well, could have been at the library in Alexandria. You know, this is something that would have existed around the time that Edfu was built. It could have been at Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis, which was the city of the sun, there are some people that believe Heliopolis may have been the site of the great city of Atlantis. Whether Atlantis was just a single city or whether it was a massive culture with a capital, some do believe that Heliopolis would have been that capital. So English Egyptologist I.E.S. Edwards pointed out that Heliopolis was the site of the inventory building that had been a center of astronomical science closely connected to Giza. Sir Alan H. Gardner believed that the inventory building was some sort of archive in which Pharaoh Khufu was searching for information about the secret chambers of the primeval sanctuary of Thoth. So Heliopolis had some buildings or a building that would have housed some of this information or documentation, or may have been some sort of secret archive. So you have Alexandria, you have Heliopolis. We also have the Temple of Sais. Now, Sais is pretty interesting. This is an artist's interpretation of what it may have looked like. This is also another one of those locations that are just absolutely in ruins. This is an illustration from the 1840s, which you can really kind of barely see that there's any sort of a city that had been here. And this is today. If you think about this, Library of Alexandria, Heliopolis, Temple of Sais, all of which housed important documents, completely obliterated, and we've lost most of that knowledge. So where Sais comes into play here is with Plato. Plato, of course, wrote the Timaeus and Critias, which is where we get the Atlantis stories from, both of which are incomplete, unfortunately. Over there on the left is his great uncle Solon. Solon had received the story from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Sais. So there's your connection. So according to Plutarch, the priest that passed this down to Solon was identified as Sanchis. So of course we're told through the retelling by Plato that the Atlantean Empire existed 9,000 years before Solon. So you kind of have to math that out a little bit as far as when that would be. But basically it puts it in that era of the Younger Dryas, of that moment where we have the cataclysm that was essentially felt around the world, you know, where we get all those flood stories. Solon at least spent times with the priests of the goddess Neith. Now, Neith was a tutelary goddess of Sais. So basically, she was a guardian or protector of a particular place, and this had to be Sais. But she was also an early, powerful Egyptian deity, the goddess of creation. So she basically created the world according to the Egyptian mythology. So the Esna Temple records an account of creation in which Neith brings forth the Nun, the first land from the primeval water. So she would have been the one that created the land that was destroyed, that we talked about when we were back there at Edfu. So what's interesting is, okay, so this is the Temple of Esna. And again, we're told that Neith brings forth the first land from the primeval waters. She's a creation goddess. And what we see at Esna are depictions of the raising of the temple. This is actually, Jonny's pointing at levitation. And we see this at Edfu as well. It's actually just in a little side room. But here's the temple on the ground. And then we see the raising of the temple here in the next frieze, which is exactly what we're seeing at Esna. So you have these connections from Sais with the goddess Neith to Esna, and then you're seeing the Esna depiction also played out there at Edfu, which is again that creation story, which goes back to Neith at the Temple of Sais. But unfortunately, again, Edfu is only a partial record of whatever the original was. There would have been more. We don't know if Sais would have had the complete record, but it had more to the story, which is where Solon got this Atlantis story that he passed down eventually to Plato. But I really appreciate all of you hanging out this evening talking about the Egypt and Atlantis connection. Of course, we have the Stargates of Ancient Egypt tour coming up here in February. So we're going to be checking out several of these places. Not only are we going to be talking about the Stargates, but there are a lot of those Atlantean connections as well that I believe that, I mean, again, it's connected universe. It's all connected. So, all right, everybody, have a good evening. Till next time, if time really exists.